Hi guys. Let's Hi guys. Let's get started. Where do I start? So updates. Let's start by updates. Did you guys go see the videos on YouTube? The video, not videos. Everything's good, working, kind of.
Just audio sounds weird in the beginning a bit, like a high-pitched noise kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't know what's wrong with the audio system in this classroom, but I don't know. Maybe I'll edit it out or see what's happening, or yeah, we'll continue like this. We'll see. Do you have any questions to me about anything that you have to do for this class? No? Okay. So today is a lecture that will be included in next week's quiz. Okay. Carbohydrates, then we're going to look at lipids, and then proteins, if I remember correctly how I ordered them. The lecture is pretty simple, so we might finish somewhat quickly. I'll see how far we are, and if we reach 7:30 and we're pretty far, we'll just not take a break, if that's okay with you, and then finish early. Okay? So you can go see the fireworks. Deal? Good. Okay. So carbohydrates, I repeated this like 10 times this semester, but they're one of the 3 macronutrients which are required in large amounts for your body to function. They are the only ones that produce energy, so the macronutrients. They are the preferred energy source for your nerve cells. If you didn't know, your brain requires about 20 to 25% of your total load of sugar in the body, and so 20 to 25% of the energy goes to your brain, even though its size is about 2% of your whole body. Okay, so it's very energy hungry, and it prefers glucose mainly for carbohydrates, mainly because they are easier to metabolize and produce energy more quickly. And as you know, your brain is firing nonstop, and so it's not a long thing, right? It's a short-term energy requirement. So that's the first thing. Your blood cells only use glucose, so that's another thing, which has implications for the ketone diet, which I'll get to at the end of the lecture. But if you don't eat sugar, very hard to get it from somewhere else. It takes more time to come from lipids, and because of that, it's not good for your brain, which requires a lot of quick energy, a lot of glucose, and so the ketone diet, not very good. Okay, and I'll tell you that in a bit. I just want you to remember that it's made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Why am I saying this? It's because molecules that are made of these can produce energy, and so the carbon will be metabolized and used for energy production. Obviously, the good sources of carbohydrates, no need to say, but fruits, vegetables, and grains. There are 2 types. You probably learned this in biochemistry. I'll be repeating this. The only difference is that it will be much simpler than biochemistry until we get to the metabolism lecture. Okay? So there's 2 types. There's the simple carbohydrates and the complex carbohydrates, and the only difference between them is the number of sugar molecules or of molecules found in them. Let's say it this way, not sugars. So simple carbohydrates usually contain 1 to 2 molecules, and they're often referred to as sugar. Glucose, fructose, maltose, lactose, galactose, etc. Complex carbohydrates have hundreds to thousands of molecules, and they're usually known as fibers, starch, or glycogen. Okay? So that's pretty much this slide here. That's what I just said. So simple carbohydrates, 1 to 2 molecules. You have the simple ones, which are the 1 molecule ones, which are glucose, fructose, and galactose. These molecules are 6 carbon molecules. That means they're called hexose. And if you remember from your genetics or from any biology class, there are also pentose sugars, and pentose sugars are mainly found for genomic DNA and, well, just DNA in general, and for RNA, so ribose and deoxyribose. Okay? So the only difference between these is the arrangement of the carbons and where you find the hydroxyl groups. Okay? Fructose is one of the healthiest of the sugars. It's also one of the sweetest. This is the one you find mainly in honey, for example. Cool. Glucose is the main energy molecule in your body. And so if we were to talk about a currency for energy in the body, it's glucose. Everything gets broken down to glucose, fructose or galactose, and these enter the glycolysis pathway. So fructose gets modified, glucose gets modified, and they end up being pretty much the same molecule, okay? It's just they enter at different steps of the pathway. Glucose is a sugar that is also made by photosynthesis, so this is important to know, not the others. So photosynthesis produces glucose, which is found in the vegetables that you eat and all that. Pretty basic information. Now, those are called monosaccharides. Then you have the disaccharides. The disaccharides are just a combination of two monosaccharides. And the main three ones that we're interested in are lactose, which is found in milk, maltose, and sucrose. And they all have their specificities in terms of what they do and how they're broken down. So lactose is a combination of glucose and galactose. Maltose is just two glucose together. And this one is important because the fibers that we'll be looking at, the starch we'll be looking at, is basically a chain of glucose. And so when you cut it down into smaller pieces, it leads to maltose. Okay? So this is important to know. Last lecture I talked about an enzyme called maltase. So maltase is important for breaking down maltose into a single unit sugar, aka a single monosaccharide. And then you have sucrose. Sucrose is the sugar you find in sugarcane, honey, and things of the sort, but also the sugar that you eat at home. Okay? And it's a mix of glucose with fructose. These are bound by something called a glycosidic bond. So it's a covalent bond between both monosaccharides, and breaking it requires energy, but then when they get metabolized, they produce more energy. Okay? Now, obviously, you have disaccharides, but you also have more than that. So you can have 3 to 10 monosaccharides. This is called an oligosaccharide. So it's a class of saccharides that contain between 3 to 10 monosaccharides in chain. Just one of the examples, there's many of them, but one of them that you might have heard of is raffinose. Raffinose is the combination of galactose, glucose, and fructose. Okay, these are just examples. And then you have polysaccharides. Polysaccharides means many saccharides together. And so between hundreds to thousands of glucose molecules chained. Not fructose, not sucrose, not just glucose in chains. Okay? And there's 3 types. Starch, which is the storage form of glucose in plants. Glycogen is the one for animals, and it's primarily in the liver and in the muscles, so that's where the storage happens. And then you have fibers. Fibers cannot be digested. Okay, when I say cannot be digested by humans, but in humans they get digested by bacteria. Okay, so not by humans, but in humans by bacteria. So they still get digested, okay, partially. And they are important for digestive health. If you remember, I told you our last slide there about constipation. Well, one way to decrease that is through eating enough fibers. Okay. Pop quiz. When you eat, okay, so let me start with this because in the American culture we don't eat much liver, but in other cultures like the European or North African or Asian culture, we do eat liver. You probably are aware of foie gras, so this is one of the ways that liver is eaten. Very expensive way though, but it contains glycogen when the animal is alive, because that's where you store, that's how it stores the glucose into a polysaccharide. When it comes to your plate, I have a question for you. Does it have glycogen or no? Pop quiz. Sorry? Liver. If you eat cooked liver or whatever liver, even if it's raw, like the Liver King. Okay, this is a question that I actually asked myself this morning because I was thinking, like, I've never seen a place where we're talking about eating glycogen. So what happens is that when the animal dies or is sacrificed, the animal is still producing enzymes, and so it will produce enzymes that will break down glycogen. Okay, so when it gets to your plate, it only has glucose. So we do not consume glycogen. Okay, there are information. I don't know if it's interesting, but I found that crazy. Okay. So now in a diagram form, if we're talking about these polysaccharides, so we talked about starch. Starch has two forms: amylose, which is a linear chain of glucose. Amylopectin is a branched chain of glucose, and they're all bound by glycosidic bonds. Glycogen is more branched than the amylopectin, as you can see here. And then fibers are just layered glucose molecules. So you can see how these ones are easier to break than this, right? Because the enzymes have a hard time getting inside, while these are easier to break because they provide more surface area. Okay. If you want to remember it this way. It's a bit more complex than this, but this is one way to remember it for the exam. Okay. Fibers, you can find them in leaves, stems of plants. And then, so this I talked about. In the plant cells, starch will be stored as globules. They're just kind of a bilayer membrane, kind of a liposome, but with starch in it. Okay? And then there's a type of fiber, just a type of starch, just to mix you up a little bit. So starch gets digested. Gets broken down. Glycogen gets broken down. Fibers do not get broken down by humans. Okay, but there is a type of starch that does not get broken down, and this is what we call fiber. Okay, and the reason why they are largely indigestible by humans, it's because they have one specific type of glycosidic bond. So glycosidic bonds, you have the alpha, beta, etc. One of them is the beta bond, and because this glycosidic bond called the beta bond links those sugars, it's quite complicated to break. Okay, so it does not get broken down. The bacteria can do it though. And so these resistant starches, bacteria like them because they're full of glucose molecules and they're able to break them down, and so they serve as prebiotics. Right, and the sources come from grains, legumes, like lentils, etc., fruits and vegetables. Simple? Good. Glycogen. So glycogen, as I said, is stored in the liver and in your muscles. And it stores as just these deposits of glycogen called glycogen granules. And so if you look under electron microscope, you'll see the little bubbles here. Those are glycogen. So there is a lot here, right? Because to be able to see a molecule under electron microscope, it means it's quite big. Okay, so they are stored like this. They're not found in food. So this is the question I just asked you. It's not a dietary carbohydrate, basically. Instead, it is made in the body to store the excess glucose that you have. Fibers. There's two types in terms of their composition, and then two types related to how soluble they are. Okay, so let's start by the first two categories. So you have the dietary fibers that come from the food. Those ones are completely non-digestible, and they are the ones that I just told you about. They form the structure of the plant, so the leaves and the stem. Then you have functional fibers. So functional fibers usually come from a lab, and they're added to the food, okay? Because they have health benefits. So why do we have functional fibers? If you ever read the list of ingredients and you saw this guar gum, and you're like, what the hell is this gum? Well, this is a functional fiber. Because what happens is that when you process food, you start with something, and then at the end of the processing, you end up with losing a lot of molecules. And some of the molecules that are most lost are the fibers. It's the top shelf of whatever food you're dealing with and you're processing. And so you need to replace it. Well, you don't need to replace it, but you just don't have it in that food. So usually companies, they fortify it by adding functional fibers that they made in the lab that help you for your health. Okay? Yeah?
Stupid question maybe, but what's the point of taking a whole plant, which has many useful molecules, then stripping everything down, separating, and then adding the same stuff that was there initially, which was made in the lab?
Yeah. So the reason for that is if you want to eat something that looks good and tastes good, you need to process it in a certain way. And industrial processes to do this do break up the food, right? If you take an orange, for example, and you're trying to make orange juice and you remove the peel from it, you're not eating it, well, you have to fortify it kind of. This is a crazy example. I don't have any in my head about processed food, but just to think of it this way. We don't eat that, how do you say this in English? The peel, there you go. I lose my words sometimes, but the peel. And so because you lose it in the processing, including the peel that's on top of each segment of the orange, you need to kind of replace it. This is just an example that doesn't actually exist in real life, but you can imagine this simple example and expand it to processed food. Okay? Pectin is a dietary fiber. Guar gum is functional fiber. And then if you want to count the total fibers in your diet, you need to look at the diet in the food that you're eating. You take a look at the dietary and the functional fibers. Okay, sometimes they're written, sometimes they're not. Right. One thing that Health Canada does is, I'm not sure if it's a regulation. I think it is. Yeah, it is. It is. They always add iron, potassium, and calcium to the foods. Okay. If you look at anything that you're eating that is processed, you'll find iron, potassium, and calcium. And sometimes, why would you have calcium in some random food? Okay, it's a bit weird. It's because they add it to the processed food because our diets are low on those nutrients. Okay, and then if you move to different countries, because they have a different diet. For example, if you go in the Mediterranean region. The diet is more based on vegetables than on actually meat. And so because of that, they have different requirements in terms of fortifying the processed food. Okay? Here in Canada, potassium, calcium, iron is added to almost all fortified foods. Okay? Just information for you. If you look at it one day and you ask yourself, why the hell is there iron in here? And it's like a unrelated thing, like ice cream, or I don't know. Doesn't make sense, right? Okay, so now in terms of solubility, I mentioned this in lecture 1 and 2. There are soluble fibers and insoluble fibers. These are carbohydrates, remember this. And so when you're doing your calculation for the energy, remember to remove the insoluble fibers, okay? Because they do not produce any energy. They serve more to help the movement of stools, okay? So soluble fibers form a gel, and this gel can be dissolved in water. They are fermentable by the bacteria, so they do produce energy, and they help lower blood glucose. And this is just related to the lipoproteins that are found in your body. Okay, I'll show you a bit what this means in a second. And it's found in citrus fruits, berries, oats, beans, anything that sounds healthy, pretty much. Yeah. So you have pectin, as I told you, this is a naturally occurring. Gum is occurring. Guar gum is a functional fiber. And then you have mucilage. If you're asking yourself what it is, it's a soluble fiber that's found in chia seed and whatnot. Okay. Insoluble, obviously don't dissolve in water. Simple. Cannot be fermented by the bacteria, so they don't have the enzymes to break them down. All they do is help bowel movement. Okay, and whole grains are a good source of this. Seeds. Every question you'll have related to a healthy diet, just name the stuff, okay? Whole grains, seeds, legumes, vegetables, fruits, it just keeps repeating. It's the same thing. You probably are aware of cellulose. You've probably heard of it from your other classes. So cellulose is the membrane of cells, and so this is insoluble. Okay, back to this. How do you lower cholesterol by eating fibers? So just a review from last lecture, we talked about the gallbladder, which produces the bile juices, which are released into your question. Which organ? Huh? Small intestine? Good. Yeah, it's released in the small intestine, written right here. And so let's test you a bit more. One hormone is important, don't answer. One hormone is important for releasing the bile juices into the small intestine. Which one is it? Yeah? Yes, cholecystokinin. Yeah, very hard to say. So this hormone will trigger the release of the bile juices inside the intestine. Now, if you have a high fiber diet, the fiber will bind to the bile. So the bile is composed of lipids, right? Cholesterol. And so because they bind to it, they are not reabsorbed, right? And so they're released, they're eliminated. And because they're eliminated, you don't end up having high cholesterol in your body. If you have low fiber, there's less binding to it, so the bile is reabsorbed. And because it is reabsorbed, it will lead to higher cholesterol levels. Simple. It's just a question of binding. They carry the bile. Fibers carry the bile. And so if you have a low fiber diet, you are more at risk of having the stones. And if you have the stones in this duct here, then you undergo a cholecystectomy. Jeez. And then you just, the gallbladder is removed. Make sense? Good. So how do we break carbohydrates? So there's a group of enzymes called carbohydrases. Hydrase, breaking down. So the A is always for breaking down. The carbo, well, makes sense in this sense. And so there's a few of them. The salivary amylase is a carbohydrase. The pancreatic amylase is a carbohydrase. The maltase is a carbohydrate. I guess it makes sense, right? So this is the class of enzymes that break down glycosidic bonds. There is no carbohydrates in the human body that breaks fibers. But there is one in bacteria, which is found in the gut, specifically the large intestine. Okay? Good. So carbohydrates digestion, as I mentioned last lecture, it starts in the mouth with the salivary amylase, which breaks down polysaccharides into smaller polysaccharides, but also to maltose, which is a disaccharide of 2-glucose. Okay, so it does reach the level where you have already maltose in your saliva, but most of it remains as a smaller polysaccharide. And the salivary amylase comes from the salivary glands, which are right here, right? Then all this is shipped to the stomach. And so the stomach does not have carbohydrate digestion. As I mentioned last lecture, it's because the pH does not allow for these enzymes to work. And so these enzymes get actually broken down in the stomach. Okay. And carbohydrates are very strong, so they resist the HCl, but HCl is also corrosive, so it does break a little bit, but it's negligible, so we don't consider carbohydrates being digested in the stomach. Okay. Instead, we consider it happening in the small intestine and in the mouth. But most chemical digestion of these carbohydrates happens in the intestine through the pancreatic amylase, but also through other enzymes that we talked about. Maltase, lactase, right? Remember those? And these will break down the sugar to maltose, and maltose will be broken down to 2 units of glucose. Okay. I think I mentioned all this. What else? Yeah, so for their absorption, it's the same for everything. They go to the enterocytes, which are found on the villi of your intestine, and then they just get taken in, depending on if it's a facilitated transport or if it's an active transport, depending on the sugar that's being taken in. And then they are transported to, I think I have a question on this. No, I don't. Okay, so they're transported to the liver, and the liver then ships them to wherever they need to be. Okay? Question. So if you eat a slice of white bread and your blood glucose level does not rise, which of the enzymes you are missing? So bread, does it have fibers or does it have lactose? Does it has a little bit of sugar? What was the main thing it has? It comes from seeds, right? Bread comes from wheat. Sorry? Maltase. The enzyme is maltase. Yes, exactly. So most probably it's maltase that's not working. And if we had to add other enzymes, we could talk about salivary amylase, we could talk about pancreatic amylase, but in this case it's not in the answer because those would be valid answers too. So there is a little bit of sucrose in the bread because when you prepare it, it contains, you make it with sugar, and so sucrase would be a valid answer, but it's the least valid of these here. The one that is the most valid is maltase. Okay, we can even argue. So obviously, this question here is just to make you think. My questions are less in the exam will be less. There's only one answer basically, so you either know it or not. Okay. In reality, when you're making the bread, if you don't know it, sometimes you use milk, egg, sugar, right? So we can argue lactase also. We can argue sucrase, but if your blood glucose does not rise, it's most probably because of maltase, which is the one that breaks all the polysaccharides into the dimers, okay, which then breaks them, the last enzyme which breaks the dimers of maltose into glucose. Make sense? Okay, good. Next. You eat a bowl of blackberries for snack. Your snack includes what type of fibers? Okay, so this one here, do you remember? You saw it in a slide before. The insoluble, yes, exactly. Why are you saying that? Sorry.
Cellulose is insoluble?
Yeah, exactly. So cellulose is insoluble, and then mucilage, pectin, and gum are soluble. Okay, so it was in the slide for right here. Cellulose, insoluble, and the others are soluble. Okay, gum, pectin, mucilage. Small little details just to see if you're following, but you got this. Okay, so digestion of carbohydrates. Let's just take a look at this quickly. I said pretty much everything, but I'm just going to add a few things. You're chewing, your body releases the salivary amylase, which breaks down polysaccharides into smaller polysaccharides and sometimes into maltose, which is a disaccharide of glucose. This goes into your stomach. The stomach is too acid, so the salivary amylase gets destroyed. And then everything goes into your intestine. So when it reaches there, you have the pancreas releasing the pancreatic amylase, and other cells releasing maltase, sucrase, and lactase. Those break down everything into smaller sugars to the point where they bring them to monosaccharides in the intestine. And then they are sent to the liver, so those monosaccharides. The rest, what I mean by the rest, are the fibers. The fibers continue on to go on to the colon, the insoluble fibers, by the way, not the soluble ones. The soluble ones undergo the same treatment. The insoluble ones, they go into the large intestine and they get digested by bacteria, okay? Because they have an enzyme to break them down. And the remainder, out, okay? Good. Now let's do a little bit of biochemistry. A few transporters that you need to know. So we talked about active transport and facilitated diffusion of sugar molecules last lecture. Now I'll tell you what transporters are important. So as I said, the monosaccharides are absorbed by the villi. The villi have these transporters on their membrane that will take glucose, galactose, and fructose in. So glucose and galactose require energy to be transported. So they will use something called the sodium glucose transport protein, SGLT1. And this will use the transport of sodium and glucose at the same time. It's like those Na sodium potassium pumps that you probably learned about. Well, this is a similar thing. The only difference is that you're carrying glucose and sodium, and because of this, the energy used in the transport of sodium is sufficient to carry glucose or galactose. So that's one thing. Fructose does not require energy, so it's facilitated diffusion, so it's basically just a transmembrane transporter, kind of a hole in the membrane with proteins on each side, and this one is called GLUT5. Okay, so these are found on the membrane of the villi, And what else? Inside the cells, you need to now, from the intestine through the villi, need to bring it to the bloodstream. And the bloodstream, you'll use something else called the GLUT2 transporter. One thing that is weird is that the transport from the intestine to the cells requires energy for glucose, but when you reach inside the cell to the bloodstream, you're using a facilitated transport. Okay? And this is just due to the potential across the membrane for the intestine. Okay? Because of that, you need energy, but when you're inside the cell to go to the blood, you don't need energy. So GLUT2 is not a sodium glucose transport protein. Okay? It looks like this. So this I just mentioned. So in the lumen, as I said, you have the villi. So what happens is that there's 2 molecules of sodium that are carried inside. This provides energy for carrying 1 molecule of glucose inside. And then to ship out the sodium, there is an exchange using a sodium-potassium pump, which will basically just bring in potassium, sodium, and then obviously potassium needs to leave, so there's, another transporter. But what's interesting for you is this part here. Just to understand that 2 molecules of sodium bring 1 glucose molecule, and then there's a pump that takes out the sodium back and then brings in potassium. Cool. GLUT2, which is between the intestine and the blood, is facilitated transport, not active transport. Okay. Good. So, this I mentioned, when you have too much glucose in your blood, it gets stored for later use. This is one of the complex forms of carbohydrates, glycogen, and glycogen is mainly stored in the liver and in your muscles. The main organ to store it is the liver, and then comes after it the muscle. And then when you are in deficit of energy and glucose, then your body will start breaking down the glycogen to make smaller pieces of saccharides to the point where you reach glucose. Okay, you make glucose. So, questions? Yeah?
Is glucose absorbed by cells that are not microvilli the same way?
That's a very good question. In the brain, I know that the sodium glucose transport protein does exist, but there's about 25, I think, transporters of glucose. So you see that one was, so it goes from 1 to 25. So depending on which cell you're dealing with, you do have a specific one for it. Because the nervous system works with sodium and potassium, then it only makes sense that the transporter also works in kind of a similar way, right? So they're kind of coupled. But specifically, I am not sure, I cannot give you an example of what cell would use the GLUT2 other than the cells lining the bloodstream. Yes?
Follow-up, similar
Yeah.
reaction, is fructose absorbed the same way?
Yes. Fructose is not absorbed with the sodium. Well, no, it's not the same way, sorry. It's not active transport. Fructose.
But like for other cells besides the microvilli, is it also just...
Always facilitated, always.
Could that be like a way to treat diabetes?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's research that shows finally something in my field. There's research that's happening actually in the lab where I was. Well, still I'm here for another month, but What they are doing is looking at, they're basically giving a diet only with fructose to mice that have diabetes, and then a diet that contains only glucose, and they're looking if it affects obesity and type 2 diabetes, and the preliminary data shows that it does help for type 2 diabetes. Okay. The thing with type 2 diabetes is, obviously mice are not as complex as humans, so that's the first thing. So the thing with diabetes is that humans have something additional compared to mice, which is thinking. And so thinking leads to your habits, and so even though you would supplement with fructose to try to treat it, but if your discipline is not good, then you have a problem, right? Because the type 2 diabetes mainly is a metabolic disease, and it's caused by poor, most of the time, okay, by poor habit choices, right? And so you could supplement with fructose, but then is that person going to do whatever else is required to heal, or they're going to do just the fructose itself? It's not going to help, that's for sure. You would require way too much fructose to deal with the whole obesity or type 2 diabetes situation, okay? Good. So next, we talked about digestion, the enzymes, the structures, now the hormones. So the lectures will look exactly like this. Last lecture where I talked about the digestive system, I went through kind of the organs, followed by the different steps, followed by the hormones. So this is the same thing that's going to happen for lipids and proteins, okay? It's just now I'm giving you the specifics kind of for each one. So the hormones that control blood glucose, I'm just giving you these here as an example. Obviously there's a lot more, but the main ones are insulin, glucagon, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. And I'll go into each one of them right now to see, to tell you what they do. So let's start by insulin. Insulin tells your brain that you have too much glucose in the blood. If you have type 1 diabetes, you do not produce insulin. You need to inject it. And so because of not producing insulin, you can end up having a lot of problems. So you need to follow kind of your injection routine, let's say, okay? I know people that have this small like thing, they just do it. There's one group in China that recently cured type 1 diabetes using gene therapy. And so now that lady that was treated does not need the insulin injections. So in the next 5 years, I wouldn't be surprised if the injections would not be needed anymore, okay? So this is a good thing. Type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes can lead to a lot of problems. One of the main ones that you guys probably know is losing sight. So your nerve behind the eye just goes crazy. So yeah, type 2 diabetes, very simple. Well, not very simple. Just do a lot of exercise and eat healthy food, and your system should be cleared up. Otherwise, they give you this drug called metformin, glucophage, if you ever know anyone in this. Extra information, okay? Not exam stuff. So insulin, at the molecular level, without me showing you this, just if you think about it, you're trying to take glucose from the blood to decrease the level of glucose in the blood. So obviously insulin will signal your cells to produce these carrier proteins, which I just mentioned, right? And so what insulin will do is it will act on the cells to tell them, just produce more of these transporters and put them on the membrane so that they can help carry glucose from the blood to the body, especially for muscle, fat, and liver cells. And it also, so obviously you can overload the body with glucose, and so if you have all these receptors taken in, what do you do with the glucose that's inside the cells? Well, now you need to store it in a form that is that can be kind of permanent, let's say, or more long-term, not permanent. And so it will also stimulate glycogenesis. And glycogenesis is just a term saying all the enzymes required to produce glycogen from glucose. So there are enzymes that will just bind glucose molecules together, okay? and this is for later use. So first, we deal with the immediate need of moving the glucose inside the body and moving it to different places. And second, now it's inside the cells. We don't want to overload the cell with glucose because it will just keep metabolizing it and just basically burn the cell. So you want to store it in a form that is not metabolized for later use. In this case, muscle cells, for example, and fat cells, there's GLUT4. So this is to answer the question, is there the same transporters, right? So for muscle cells and fat cells, glucose transport does not require sodium, does not require active transport. So insulin promotes the transcription and transport of this GLUT4 receptor to the membrane. And the way it does this, the cells need to be quite fast at doing this. So what they do is they will keep the GLUT4 transmembrane protein in these vesicles like this. And the moment insulin comes in and signals to these cells to start acting because there's glucose, these vesicles will be transported to the membrane and will basically act as doors for the glucose. Okay? So they're always ready to go. If I've done a bit of research on insulin, and after injecting the cells with a very small amount for 10 minutes, there's already a reaction that you can see in terms of protein levels or RNA changes or things like this, okay? So this needs to be quite fast. Why does it need to be quite fast? Well, if you leave too much glucose in your blood, you'll have a lot of issues related to, it's basically an accelerated diabetes on the spot, okay? Yeah.
Where are the endocytosis, why the endocytosis takes place when the glucose receptors take glucose?
That's a very good question. Let me think. What does endocytosis? Mainly because you need to keep a certain amount of glucose in the blood, and so you cannot go below it or above it. If you go below it, glucagon will be activated and tell your body to break down glycogen and all that. So you want to keep a certain level of glucose in your blood. Okay, this is just to keep all physiological function of the body normal. And so if you don't take back the GLUT4, it will just continue taking in the glucose, right? So you don't want that. Good? Okay. Insulin acts through these insulin receptors on the membrane. So insulin is released by the pancreatic cells, but it acts on a lot of places. Okay, it acts on the muscle, the liver, it acts on the brain, and it acts on the fat cells. And so where does it bind? It binds to something called the insulin receptor, and the insulin receptor will basically have a cascade of events, and I don't want to get into the proteins here that are involved, but just call this the AKT pathway, okay? And this AKT, it's the last, so it's a phosphorylation event of different kinases. So basically, I'll tell you, okay, I'm not expecting this detail in the exam, so I'll just tell you so you understand. So insulin binds to the insulin receptor, which leads to the phosphorylation of the insulin receptor substrate, and this will phosphorylate a series of, well, first this enzyme, then these lipids, which we'll cover later on, and then these will transfer the phosphate to more enzymes, blah, 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 until you reach AKT. AKT is a central kinase in your body. It does almost everything related to energy metabolism. When it's active, it means the body has energy. It's time to deal with it, okay? And so AKT does a million things. One of them is activating the transport of these GLUT4 vesicles, which are, as I said, vesicles carrying the glucose transporters, okay?
So like they're inside the cell and then the insulin receptor triggers the pathway which gets to AKT, then the receptors get on the surface of the cell from inside?
Yeah, exactly. And so why is this happening? It will basically use energy to move the vesicles through the cytoskeleton, because the cytoskeleton requires energy to move stuff, okay? So this is what it means. When you eat a lot of amino acids, when you eat a lot of sugar, AKT gets activated to deal with it, okay? This is what I said in a diagram, if you prefer a diagram. And so the insulin will just go to different cells and tell them to take in the sugar. It will even go to tissue cells to tell it to take the sugar and use it as energy. The liver to store the glucose into glycogen. Muscle, same thing. And in the fat tissue, it will induce lipogenesis because the sugar does not get transformed into glycogen in the fat tissue, in the adipose tissue, but it gets transformed into lipids. And so this is how you basically get overweight. Yeah?
Last lecture, you told us you can suggest it that it takes sequential, like you first like fill your liver and muscles with glycogen and then excess glucose participate in adipogenesis, right?
Yeah.
Is it sequential or is it just happen at the same time in parallel?
Right. So obviously now we're talking about 2-3 molecules at the same time, but in two like hormone and molecules at the same time. But in reality, metabolism network is crazy. Okay, there's thousands of different reactions, and so you have to see it this way. The way it works is that the first place where you get this glucose is the liver, and so the liver, when it receives the glucose, already starts glycogenesis, right? Then it distributes it through the bloodstream to different places. The last one to get it is your fat tissue. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second, when you have an overload of sugar here, the enzymes that are produced to make glycogen, so the glycogenesis pathway, the enzymes involved in there, themselves act as signaling molecules to tell it, that's it, we're overloaded, move elsewhere, right? And now they get in the muscle. The muscle has a certain amount that it needs of glucose for quick exercise, let's say, or movement. And the rest, which is unnecessary, gets detected by that cell from different receptors, and it tells it storing glycogen. And the remainder, because now you can only take up so much, the liver cannot be just full of glucose receptors. And the amount of glucose receptors on the liver and muscle and adipose tissue are different. So one has more than the other, and this is how you have this distribution. So initially, in the first seconds, it starts at the liver. The liver distributes through the portal vein to through the hepatic vein to other places. And so the first thing that gets it is the heart. The heart sends it everywhere. Muscle, adipose tissue, brain, etc. Okay? So it's a question of what happens first, and then how much of the receptors are found in those cells that can take up glucose. There's only one door, so you can only take in one person at a time. But maybe the liver has 2 doors, and so then there's 2 glucose molecules that come in, and the muscle maybe has 1, and then the fat has 1. Okay? So this is pretty much it. The muscle and the liver, they do signal to the body that there's too much glucose inside of them, and so that tells the body, ship it to the next place of storage, which is the adipose tissue. Okay? Good. So that's simple. Well, not that simple, but that's the first part. Now, glucagon, just imagine it as the opposite of insulin. Glucagon detects the fact that, signals that there is no glucose in the blood, very low glucose. So I'll give you the numbers, but you don't need to know them. Depending on which country you're working in, they either work in millimolar or in grams. Here in Canada, it's in millimolar. So when you do your blood test, it will come in as millimolar. The regular amount is about 4 to 5.5, I think, millimolar. So the moment that there's a drop in the blood, the total amount, which is total concentration, which reaches 3 millimolar, your body detects that and starts making glucagon from the alpha cells of the pancreas, not the beta cells. Okay? And what this does, well, there's no more glucose because the person maybe has not eaten, or the person is fasting, or the person is in a ketone diet. And so what happens is that glucagon will tell the liver to do a few things. First, it will tell it to do the opposite of glycogenesis, which is glycogenolysis, which is breaking down the glycogen. And this is just basically the transcription of many enzymes that are involved in the pathway of glycogenesis. Okay? Briefly, because we'll do all the metabolism stuff later on. Okay? So the second thing, we're producing glucose from glycogen. That's the first thing. And the second thing is gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose from amino acids. If you don't eat a lot, for example, in countries where famine still exists, or if you are fasting for many hours, the first thing that gets used up is the glucose. When you lose the glucose, two things get activated. The breakdown of fat. When you don't have any more fat, gluconeogenesis happens. And so when you have gluconeogenesis happening, basically you are losing muscle mass. So your body starts eating up the muscle mass that you have to produce glucose. Because without glucose you cannot live, but without muscle you can survive, you know? So this is it. So if you, for example, watch those TV shows where they talk about kids from different countries that are not eating, and you realize that their body are kind of skinny meg, this is due to the fact that their body is using gluconeogenesis to produce glucose. So technically you could survive a while without eating, as long as you have enough muscles to provide your body with energy. Make sense? Good? Okay. Same story. Glucagon goes to the liver, but it also goes to the muscle cells. So this is just a diagram to show you what's happening. But in the liver specifically, it activates two things, glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Okay? And then when the blood level reaches the normal amount, the glucagon just is removed from the bloodstream, and then if you eat too much, insulin comes back, and it's just a cycle. Okay? The next one, epinephrine and norepinephrine. You guys probably know this as adrenaline. So adrenaline is a commercial name. It's not the actual molecule. The actual molecule is called epinephrine. If you ever had anyone close to you that has an allergy, they use an EpiPen. It's because the EpiPen contains epinephrine, which will basically take care of the anaphylactic shock. Okay? But for our course, the epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced in the adrenal glands, which are found above the kidney, kind of like a hat like this. And they will produce, they will basically be secreted when glucose is low. And it will induce the same thing as the insulin, the glucagon, which is breakdown of glycogen. Okay? This is responsible for the flight or fight reactions. If you've ever been scared, à la ronde, for example, then you probably felt your legs kind of shaky. That's due to epinephrine, okay, acting on your body. So the main goal of epinephrine and norepinephrine is more to prepare the body for danger. And so sometimes even when the glucose is high, it will still lead to glycogen breakdown because it's just a reaction that happens due to a perceived danger. Okay? Take care. Cortisol and growth hormone. So let's start by the cortisol. So they're secreted by adrenal glands and they act on the liver, okay? And muscle and adipose tissue, and their goal, so this is a stress hormone. You probably heard of this. Growth hormone is the hormone that allows you to build muscle mass and grow up while you're as a kid. Some people use it kind of to enhance their gains at the gym, and there are different variations of the growth hormone. So cortisol will just prepare your body for stress. It's kind of like epinephrine and norepinephrine, but it's not immediate danger, right? And so cortisol will increase the levels of gluconeogenesis and decrease the muscle glucose use, okay? You want to, the goal of cortisol is just to increase as much as possible the amount of glucose in the blood, okay? Do you see how cortisol can lead to health problems? If you have stress, constant stress every day, and you don't deal with it, you basically end up taking amino acids, turning them into glucose. So that leads to muscle mass loss. And then also you decrease muscle glucose usage, so that leads to weakness. And increase in blood glucose will lead to many different problems, including neuropathy. For example, the optic nerve gets damaged, etc. Okay? So this is one thing. The growth hormone, will increase fatty acid mobilization. It will actually switch kind of the metabolism from glucose to fatty acids. The reason for this, it's basically trying to produce as much energy as possible, and growth hormone does many things. One of them is muscle mass gain, okay? And so one reason why it is dangerous for growth hormone is because it increases the chances of cancer, because your body is basically in growth mode. And because it is in growth mode, what does growth mean? It means more cells, bigger cells. And so more cells, well, at some point you're going to end up getting unlucky, and one of those cells will have a mutation that leads to cancer. Okay? Growth hormone is very regulated by the body. It's not secreted all the time. You get most of it when you're a kid, right about adolescence, puberty, let's call it this way. That's where you start actually producing a lot of it to help for the rapid growth that is needed. Okay? What else? Yeah, I think that's it. Question. Glucagon, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. So all these hormones, they all act to increase blood glucose level. Which organ is influenced by all of them at the same time? Does epinephrine act on the adipose tissue? No. So norepinephrine doesn't either. Does cortisol act on the adipose tissue? No. What about growth hormone? Maybe. I mean, we don't know. But one thing is clear. Sorry? The liver, exactly. So all these enzymes, they act, all these hormones, geez, so many molecules. All these hormones, they act on the liver. Okay? Did we ever talk about any hormone going to the pancreas? Did we? Last lecture. Okay, review it. I'll let you go back to the slides so you can, there's a diagram where I'm showing like all the hormones going everywhere, so find the pancreas in there, okay? So, how do we follow blood glucose in terms of Health Canada and all that stuff? So there's a concept called glycemic index, and it's just a term used to say what's the potential of a food to release glucose in the blood, and we use it to determine how the food affects us. Okay, so a hyperglycemic index will cause a sudden surge in glucose. It means a high level of glycemic index. You can imagine it as a lot of glucose being released quickly in the blood. Okay. The second reaction in the chain is a lot of insulin comes after, because now we have too much glucose. And then that leads to a fall in glucose right after that, which is also dramatic. So because you have high levels of insulin, insulin signals back to the body to get glucagon when it's done, right? And so glucagon will also, insulin will be released in the blood, and it will lead, because there's a lot of it, it will lead to a high level of glucose uptake in the liver, in the adipose tissue, and in the muscles. Okay, forget the glucagon story I just said here. I'm a little bit sleepy. So low glycemic index or hypoglycemic index is low to moderate fluctuations in glucose in your blood. If you eat food from outside around noon and then you are falling asleep right after, it is probably due to the dramatic fall in blood glucose. Okay? So you can control that the down in energy that you have after eating food by making sure that the food has a low to moderate glycemic index. Make sense? Just eat a poutine tomorrow at noon and you'll understand what I mean by glycemic index, okay? So that's pretty much it. So this is one way to be able to focus and work in the afternoon. Now, it's not always easy to predict. The reason for that is we don't eat food separately. It's more of a preparation, and because it is a preparation, then it's a mix of glycemic indexes. And so it's a combination, and so it's hard to kind of figure out the glycemic index of a specific food, okay? So there's also another concept called the glycemic load, which determines the effect of food on a person's glucose response. So it's not linked to the glucose levels, it's linked to the glucose response, okay? So one is directly linked to insulin, the other is linked to the quantity of glucose in the blood, okay? And so this one is just the way you get to the glycemic load is by multiplying the number of the grams of carbohydrates by the glycemic index of each of the foods, okay? Very long calculation. You'll probably maybe do it once in the exam, or I don't know. We'll see, and then you'll forget about it. But this is mostly used by nutritionists and Health Canada to determine the quality of the effect of food on glucose and insulin. Okay, we use it a lot in research because when you're studying the effect of a certain diet on mice, for example, you need to take a look at the insulin levels and the glucose levels, and then you can determine if your treatment is working or not working, okay? But it is considered more useful than the glycemic index because it includes specific index for each of the food, okay? The lower glycemic index food are actually much better because they allow for a slow absorption of glucose, which leads to a lower chance of heart disease. Fiber help lower this glycemic index because they still serve as carbohydrates, but not digested. Do you guys need a break? I don't know how many slides I'm at. No. Keep going. Okay. There's a few slides left, so it should be good. Jeez. Okay. For the foods with a lower glycemic index, I put a table here. Let me tell you about the table first. So you'll be surprised by some stuff. You've always, so you think that the stuff you eat, some of the stuff like vanilla cake has a high glycemic index. Actually, there are other foods that you are eating in your diet right now that have a higher one. For example, potatoes, right? So that's why the poutine is coming here. This is one of the reasons why you're falling asleep from this. Scones, do you know what this is? It's like some cookies kind of that are full of sugar. Each scone, I think, has 45 grams of, like a small portion like this has 45 grams of carbohydrates, okay? So crazy stuff. The only one is peanut butter. 0 glycemic index. I always thought that it has tons of sugar, but apparently it does not, okay? So you can take a look at this and play with this and see what's happening, and then eat it and be like, yeah, that's because it has a high glycemic index. I'm falling asleep, okay? So this is it. Now let me go back to this slide, which is more important than the other one. So the body aims, so this is referring to the question that we had before about the transporters. Why are they taken back in? So the body has a level of glucose that it needs to maintain in the blood. And so if you have a high surge or a surge of glucose because of a high glycemic index meal, your body needs to bring that down quickly before there's damage that's caused in your body, okay? So it goes steep up, steep down, okay? And this is the part where you feel like you're falling asleep, because actually when it's going down, it goes a little bit lower than what's healthy for you, and your body thinks that there's no energy for a short period of time, and so it signals that it's tired, to decrease the energy usage by your body, okay? So let me explain. It goes up fast while it's going down, while it's being removed because there's too much insulin being produced. It goes down, but it goes below the normal level, right? Because it's not perfectly controlled, so it goes below the normal level. When this happens, something gets triggered in your body through a cascade of events telling it, whoa, there's no energy. Although you just ate a ton of sugar. It just tells it there's no energy, chill. Let's wait for it to come back. But in reality, it's kind of a fake effect, okay? There are people that say it's also because blood flows to your digestive system and all that and all this stuff. This is the reason, okay? The other thing, when you're eating a low glycemic index meal, as you can see, it's more controlled. So it never goes below the blood level that is required to always be there. So the 3.5 that I told you about to 5.5 millimolar in the blood, okay? Also, its uptake is slower. Why is it slower? It's because the body detects, oh, there's only a small amount of glucose, so let's make a small amount of insulin, okay? And each insulin molecule does not serve for only one glucose, it serves for many. And so if you're producing less insulin, exponentially you're taking in less glucose, and so you have a slower intake of this glucose. Simple? Hard? No idea. Yeah. So about the exponential stuff? Okay. So one molecule of insulin will serve to taking a lot of glucose. So if you, and the amount of insulin here is exponential, okay? So it's shown like this, but it's exponential, the amount that comes up, okay? It's just to tell you basically it's steep. So this exponential phase here where you have an increase in insulin, a lot of insulin means the amount of glucose you're taking is multiplied by a huge factor, right? But if you have a low glycemic meal, that means you have less glucose, and so your body detects it as small amount of glucose, it releases only a little bit of insulin. And so that's why it takes a longer time to take in the sugar, okay? But this is, I'm talking about exponential stuff here. I don't want to mix you up. Just understand it that high increase when there's high glycemic food, glycemic index food, then it goes down below the normal level. That's why you feel tired. And then low glycemic index meal will have kind of more, take more time to take up the glucose, okay? And never goes below the homeostatic levels of glucose in your blood, okay? And then this is just another graph that's showing you the glycemic index, and they're using glucose as the reference, okay? Let's see if there's something interesting here. Yeah, not really. Jelly beans, not very. Sorry?
So in general, diet-wise, it's better to take foods with
Low glycemic index.
glycemic index than to have like a shock of
Yeah, shock and then down. I'll tell you an information unrelated to the course, but it's related to this. If you've ever watched a sports game, you see the players, they throw water inside their mouth and then they spit it. It's not because they are crazy. There's a reason for this. So when your body detects the glucose so it's, first of all, it's water with glucose. When they detect the glucose, they activate all these hormones that tell it, we have energy, time to perform, right? But they don't want to fill their body with this because of the crash after, okay? So this is why soccer players or even hockey players, you see them, they're just like throwing it everywhere and it looks like they're, I don't know what they're doing, but it's just to actually activate their body to perform, okay? And you'll see it in most sports. Cool? Sorry. So, very simple slide. You need carbohydrates because they're good for you and they provide energy. You don't see anything structural here, so please on the exam don't tell me it's for structural stuff. Energy, okay? The energy, as I said previously, each gram will produce 4 kilocalories of energy. This I said at the beginning of the slides. Red blood cells use only glucose for energy. Both carbohydrates and fat will supply energy for daily activities, but if you're, for example, doing something anaerobic or something that is kind of like a sprint, you will burn your carbohydrates first. If you're doing something more of like a marathon, then your fat supply is being used as well. Okay? Yeah, this is pretty much basic stuff. And this is what I just said. So this is the proportions that you are using when you are doing different types of sports. If you're walking quite fast with those 2 batons, you're using a lot of fat and very little carbohydrates, because these are for low to moderate intensity exercise, while carbohydrates are for high intensity. If you're swimming, well, not swimming, but pretty much racing in water, then you're going to use carbohydrates. And this is just related to the idea that glucose is easier to metabolize and make energy from than fat. Okay? Good. So if you want to lose weight, which one is best? Weird, right? You would think that more intensity means more weight loss, but no. It's a type of exercise that you also do. Okay? So either bike or walk fast. Okay? Ketosis. Okay, let me ask you. So let's say, for example, you're not taking, so the ketone diet is simply you don't take carbohydrates, okay? You don't eat carbohydrates. And then there are variations and whatnot, but let's consider the one with not taking carbohydrates. When you don't take carbohydrates, what happens? When you don't have any carbohydrate in your bloodstream, what happens?
You burn fat.
You burn fat, true. And what else do you burn? Muscle. You break muscle. Amino acids are used to produce glucose. Do you think that using amino acids and fat to produce energy is sufficient for a brain that is hungry and prefers glucose? No. What about your blood cells? Your blood cells only like glucose. So yes, it will be good for you. You're going to lose weight, guaranteed. Short term. The problem is when you continue with it for too long, what happens is that you end up in a state of ketosis. And ketosis will lead to something called ketoacidosis. And this is just your blood, because its acidity increases. So the pH decreases. This is horrible because the pH, the moment it fluctuates too much, it affects so many processes in the body. The transport does not work anymore. It can lead also to mutations because of the increase of protons in the cell, etc., etc. Okay? So there are these ketone strips that are used clinically to take a look at the blood to see the pH. Okay? And so this is gotta be careful with this. Okay? And did I talk about this? Yeah, so this is what I just said. The body, actually his answer, the body will just use different sources to make glucose, and obviously that leads to burning the fat and also muscle loss. So it's a good way to lose weight quickly, but not for a prolonged time, because that will lead to the acidity of your blood. Yeah?
The reason that the pH drops is due to the nitric acid that
Exactly. Yeah.
break down amino acids.
Yeah, exactly. So the nitric acid that is broken down from the amino acids will play on the pH. Okay? What else? Oh yeah, the other thing I forgot to mention. Amino acids, you don't want to remove them from your body and send them to make energy. You want to keep them for structure. Okay? They're the main ones for structure with lipids. And so if you start using it for energy, then obviously you're not making you're having a harder time to make new cells. New cells are important for repairing your body. They support the immune system. As you know, the immune system has hundreds of different cells, and they just keep dividing because you need fresh immune cells in your body to protect you. And so if there are no proteins or low proteins, then you end up not producing these cells, and that's not very good. Okay? Tell your friends. Now, the RDA, recommended dietary allowance, which, if you remember, is the amount of a macronutrient, or any nutrient, sorry, that is good for basically to have 97 to 98% of the population healthy, okay? For most people of our age, is 130 grams a day. This is sufficient to provide enough energy to glucose. The upper limit does not exist. We have no idea how much glucose is too much for you, okay? The EAR, the estimated average requirement, so that's the value that is for getting 50% of the population healthy, that's 100 grams for us. And if you want to find these and read on them online, I'll just show you here. Health Canada, DRI. So you can go here, you can go there, and then you can see on this website, you can have the reference value for vitamins, elements, that's minerals, in other words, and macronutrients. So macronutrients, we have carbohydrates, and then you have the digestible and non-digestible. So you can go through this table. The RDA that I told you about, right? So let's say for me, it's right here. So 130 grams, okay? And you can take a look at this for many of them. Some of them don't have values because we have no clue how much. So if you see ND, non-determinable, that's what it means. So it means that we don't know how much they can take, okay? Some of them we do, and I've been talking about pregnancy and all that. It's not just random like this. It's because this is an important distinction that you have to make when you're talking about the requirements of nutrients, okay? Yeah, so you can take a look at this. You can take a look at vitamin. This is everything that you learned. So now you can kind of read this and understand it. Cool? Good. Back to this. Right, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So the AMDR. So this one is for the amount of, this is, the RDA is for the amount of nutrient that you need, and this is the percentage of your diet that needs to be carbohydrates. So it's between 45 and 65% of your daily calories. So depending on where you stand in terms of health, in terms of pregnancy, in terms of working out, etc., it moves, okay? And obviously this is not a requirement, but fiber-rich foods are quite good for you because they improve digestion and transport. And they help reduce also chronic diseases, heart disease. Remember I told you that fibers carry the cholesterol that comes from the gallbladder. This is important because if you have cholesterol in your blood, you'll end up with atherosclerosis, and that leads to heart attack if your veins and arteries are clogged. Okay? Same. You can take a look at this table. It's just a summary of what I'm saying with more explanation. Okay? So you have an idea about this. We Canadians eat too much simple carbohydrates. Okay? This is not me saying it. It's actually research institutes. And the reason for that is we are adding sugar everywhere, okay? If you eat McFlurries or whatnot, they're full of sugar. Pretty much everything has added sugar in it. And so, I mean, this is general information. Just by logic, you probably know it, but I'm just telling you because, you know, it's part of this course. Who here drinks coffee with sugar? Do you put more than 2 spoons? Okay, so there are people, I'll tell you about my country. I'll tell you about my country. So we usually drink espressos, but the espressos are this small, but they have like 5 to 6 spoons of sugar in this small little piece of here. Okay, so it becomes almost like tar. So we do add a lot of sugar in it, and compared to, so I'm North African, compared to Africa, so this example is surprising because we're adding many spoons of sugar. Here we don't add that much sugar, but if you look at the rates of obesity, it's by a factor of 10, okay? And so the reason for that is, yeah, you're not adding the sugar, but actually all your food contains added sugar, okay? And they are simple carbohydrates. And this is not good because they accumulate as fat, and they're found in pretty much anything here. So the Institute of Medicine of Health Canada recommends that you take not more than 10% of total energy from added sugars. Okay? So, question. Replacing simple sugars with complex carbohydrates would result in which of the following? If you replace the same amount by the same amount, okay? Not anyone? No? C? Glycemic index would be higher? No. Opposite. It would be lower. Huh? A? Yes. A makes sense. So let me explain. Complex carbohydrates, remember there's 3 of them: glycogen, starch, fibers. So if you're replacing sugar by complex carbohydrate, automatically you're increasing the fiber. So this one is the answer. D is not good because you were saying that starch decreases. But starch is a complex carbohydrate, so it does not work. Glycemic index, glucose, the single molecule, which is a simple sugar, has the highest glycemic index. So then complex carbohydrates technically is the opposite. Okay? And the calorie content, if it's the same amount, is the same. Okay. Yeah.
About calorie content, one could argue that because you're drinking like let's say 1 liter of Coca-Cola, right?
Yeah.
Just an example.
Yeah.
So you're intaking a lot of calories, but in 1 hour because you will have a crash.
Yeah.
From low glucose as all it gets absorbed way too fast.
Yeah.
Low glucose makes you feel hungry, so you eat more Coca-Cola. But when you eat, let's say, buckwheat with chickpeas, let's say,
Yeah.
it will be low glycemic index, so you will not be hungry and you will eat less as a result.
It is true. So basically what he's saying is that the increase in glucose and then decrease, then you'll get more hungry and you eat more of or drink, let's say, or whatever, Coca-Cola, which has simple sugars. It does make sense. But in terms of chemistry, in terms of just taking 1 gram of simple carbohydrates and 1 gram of complex carbohydrates, they produce the same amount of energy. So this is what is meant by the question. But in reality, yes, taking on more simple sugars leads to hormones telling your body to eat more, okay? Because simple sugars feel good and they signal your body to take more of it. And so on the long term, you will be taking in more calories. But if we're talking, forget about the long term, just on the spot, I put 1 gram here and 1 gram here, and I burn them both, they produce the same amount of energy. Okay? Unless the complex carbohydrates are insoluble fibers. Okay? Yes?
On the long term, they have more energy.
Sorry?
On the long term, you said they produce more energy.
What produces more?
The complex carbohydrates.
No. No, this is just related. It's not related to the chemistry of it. It's more related to kind of the way it affects your body. So if you're taking food that has simple sugars, usually that food is more addictive. Okay? Because it is more addictive, it will make you want to eat more because of the dopamine, right? And so this is what I was mentioning. But in terms of chemistry, they have the same amount, the same caloric content. Okay? Because they're both carbohydrates. And 1 gram of one is 1 gram of one, unless the complex carbohydrates are insoluble fibers. In that case, then this is true. If they are insoluble fibers, they do not produce energy, and so B would be true in this case. Okay? A little bit of thinking. Okay, the teeth, simple. I'll explain it quite quickly. So bacteria accumulates in your teeth, and then they love sugar. So if you eat a lot of sugar and add to it not brushing your teeth, well, the bacteria does a lot of fermentation. Fermentation leads to the production of acid. Acid breaks down the enamel of your teeth. Simple. And then this here about the cholesterol, there's a slide at the beginning. So fiber allow basically carry the bad cholesterol out. And now, so the opposite is true for simple sugar. They do not bind the cholesterol, and so they allow it to stay. And so that leads to an increase in bad cholesterol, okay? And contributes to obesity. Well, if you have too much sugar, simple carbohydrates, yeah?
I think that's why simple carbohydrates can like increase bad cholesterol.
Right. So usually when the bile is released in your intestine, right, the fiber can bind to it, okay? But not all, so the fibers serve as a mechanism to decrease the amount of cholesterol in your body, okay? And it's just the affinity of the type of cholesterol to the fiber, okay? So one of them has more affinity than the other, okay? And so if you don't remove it, then the level of bad cholesterol stays in your body because it increases compared to a person that takes fiber, a lot of fiber, then you have an increase in bad cholesterol, and then it's just the affinity for the good and the bad, okay? What else? This I said at the beginning also, the fortified foods. So usually when you are refining the food, you lose a lot of the upper layers which contain fiber, complex carbohydrates. So if you look at a seed, the top, or a fruit, the top layer of the fruit or of the seed contains fiber. And so if you're processing it to, for example, make orange juice, then you'll peel it off, remove the peel, and then inside even the little pieces of orange, they have those kind of like that white structure that's holding the juices, let's say, in it. Well, that's also fiber, and that gets removed and processed. And so now you need to bring back the fiber because you need it in the diet, okay? So processed food usually fortify the food by adding fiber. Cool? And then enriched foods is when you have a food that does not actually have fiber and then they add it to it. I'll give you an example of fortified foods. Cereals. If you eat cereals in the morning and you're eating those high sugar fruit of the loom or fruit or whatever they're called. Fruit of the loom is the shirts. Thinking about printing shirts, you know. Whatever, it's been a long time I didn't eat them because I have celiac disease. Let's say cornflakes, okay? How about that? I remember those. First of all, they don't taste very good, so I used to add a lot of sugar to them. But because they do not contain, because they're made from wheat, then they lose the upper shell, which contains the fibers, and so it's being added to it. It's not the original one that you have in there. Enriched foods are foods that don't have the fibers, and then it's being added to it. Okay? Make sense? Fruit of the loom, jeez. Okay, this is what I just said here. Seed, the first top part here is the one that contains the most fiber. Okay, so this is why when you are reading, like they're telling you to eat whole grain bread, it's for this reason specifically, because of this. Did I forget something here? Okay, this is just for information. You can read this when you have time if you want to or not. This is just to show you the differences so that you can know what bread you're dealing with, but this is not exam material, okay? It's just telling you how the bread, the wheat gets processed and what gets removed, and so which bread is the best. Obviously, whole grain is the best. Then you have refined, then enriched. So enriched means it was not there because it's made from other sources, and so it's added to it. Okay? Enriched means it's coming from different sources. Not grain, and because of that, it's being added to it. Okay? Is this the last one? Okay. Now the amount of fiber you need. Now adequate intake means estimates. It's not RDA. It's not a required dietary allowance. And so for women, it's about 25 grams a day. and for men it's about 38 grams. Or you can also see it as about 14 grams per 1,000 kilocalories, so 1,000 calories. Usually you need about 2,000 calories a day, depending on whatnot. And so this is it. Cool? Make sense? Good. Good. You're tired of me or what? Close the laptop, that's it. Okay, lecture 4. Any questions, guys? Okay, good. I will be leaving now, so no questions, office hours, or, let's do it this way. If you're going to see the fireworks, I'll probably see you there, okay? Take care, buddy.